Are Christians overreacting to the mockery that happened of the Last Supper painting from the Olympics, the French Olympics that are happening in Paris right now in 2024? I'm just noticing I've got a bunch of things on my desk. Actually, you know what? I'm going to show this to you guys. Even this has nothing to do with the stream. This is actually a drawing my daughter did. I don't know if you guys can really see it. She is 9 years old, and apparently this is a drawing of me, which is pretty good. Pretty good. I'm very proud of her. So that's actually one of the reasons I've got it up here. But anyway, so today we're talking about the Olympics and whether or not Christians are kind of overreacting to what's been going on. If you actually have been paying attention, there's a lot of people that are saying that they didn't actually intend to mock Christians, including the organizers themselves, are saying that it wasn't actually intentional to mock Christianity, mock Christians. We're going to talk about all of that, but then we're also going to talk about the way that Christians have sort of responded to mockery throughout history. We've got a ton of really interesting content for you guys in this stream if you watch the entire thing. And I've also invited Joe Heschmeyer, who is a Catholic apologist and also a YouTuber over at Shameless Popery. I want you guys to go check out his YouTube channel. But Joe and I want to do more work with him because he's an awesome guy and he's got a lot of information, wealth of knowledge, and he's also just fun to talk to. Like, he and I have been kind of talking about setting up this stream, and it's been really fun to go back and forth with him. I do want to let you guys know as we kind of begin here that we've had to push this stream back a little bit because I am still currently experiencing a migraine, and my migraines, when they come on, they can last for sometimes weeks at a time. So I'm still in the middle of one. So if I seem off my game today, if I'm like, my words aren't really coming like they are now, then that's just symptom of the migraine. So I'm going to actually rely as much as I can.
Let me just second that. If I seem off my game, it's also Cameron's migraine.
No, but yeah, no. Like I was saying, so today is going to be very, very interesting. First, we're going to talk about, if you guys, just to give you kind of heads up of like what to expect if you watch this whole video, we're going to start out by talking about the whole Olympics debacle and what happened with that. We've got some new content to share with you guys. And then we're also going to get Joe's thoughts, and he hasn't really spoken about this publicly yet, so we'll get his thoughts on this. But then we're going to shift, as I mentioned, we're going to shift to talk about some of the ways that Christians have sort of historically responded to mockery in the past, and then talk about like the sort of related topics of like how should Christians respond from like a biblical perspective. And if you look into this at all, it becomes really complex because there's different ways that Jesus and others have talked about really responding to mockery or insults in the Bible. So it's not like there's this one size fits all approach when it comes to responding to mockery. And so we're going to be looking at the way that Christians have responded, and then some examples. We're not going to get too deep into the examples because like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Joe, you were even talking about this. Like, does it make sense to like show some of these images that are like literally just mocking and blaspheming Christianity?
Right.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So some of the
how do you describe this without just like putting more of a spotlight on the thing that you think is bad and shouldn't exist?
Yeah, so we'll do what we can. We'll give descriptions when appropriate, and then we'll just. I think the conversation today is going to be super interesting, actually, and we haven't ever covered this topic on the channel either. So, but Joe, it's great to have you back. I think it's been years since you've been.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
What, 2 years?
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Yeah. But so how's it going? How are you?
Oh, it's going great. I've got 3 kids now. I mean, I was a little jealous. Your daughter, who's older than my children, we've got some work to do in terms of our artistic talent. But our kids, I've got a beautiful picture of me and my wife and my daughter Stella, who's now 4, and it looks like a 4-year-old drew it, but it's clearly us, and it's nice. She made one of us smiling and one of us frowning. And she told each of us we were the smiling one and the frowning one was the other one. So she's politicking there a little bit, but we both like the image as a result.
Yeah. No, I'm liking the background. Like, you've got a new space and everything. Okay, it looks good.
Thank you. Yeah. The guys at
stepping up your game.
Zach Maxwell, he definitely stepping up the game here. It looks a lot better than last time I was on the show. I think I was in my basement then.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know we should start talking about the topic, and we will. I promise you guys we'll talk about it soon. But I was watching some of your other content, and I was actually mowing the grass the other day, and I was listening to one of your podcast episodes, and I feel like you're also increasing the quality there, just in the way that you flow and stuff, and the way that you present the content and stuff. I mean, we're all trying to get better at it, but yeah, I think you're doing a good job.
I mean, my background, I was a blogger, right? So I was used to writing 5,000 words, and that's a totally different style and a totally different skill set.
Yeah.
So it took a while to adapt first to doing audio only podcasting, and then a whole other shift getting into YouTube. And I think with each transition, you kind of have to be bad at a thing before you can be good at it. And so I'm hoping I'm getting to the end of being bad at it.
Man, I've been bad at YouTube for so long. And now I'm like starting to see a little bit of success. Like some of our most recent videos have done really, really well. And it's kind of shocked. I think some people aren't really used to it because we've just been literally so bad at YouTube. But yeah, no, we're all trying to get better and trying to have a positive impact on the kingdom. But let's start by just talking about the Olympics controversy. I mean, I've created a couple videos on this. What are your thoughts on the whole thing?
So I didn't watch the original opening ceremony. I wasn't just watching the Olympics. I first was exposed to it on social media with people just doing still images and saying this is blasphemous. This is clearly kind of a mockery of the Last Supper. And when that happened, I was like, oh, we're going to be talking about this for a while. I knew then this is going to create a whole kind of controversy. And it's part of it, I guess I would say, historically, the Olympics have been or have tried to be a place where people can kind of set aside all of the squabbles from ordinary life, geopolitical differences and everything else, and just leave all of that alone to just have a competition that by the nature of it brings us together as a human family. And that's, I get it. It's aspirational. It's all of that. It hasn't stopped countries from going to war, hasn't done any of that, but it's a little glimpse of our common humanity. And so to see that become politicized is frustrating and obnoxious. To see that become a source of more tension, regardless of where you put the blame. And I think a fair amount of the blame has to be put at the feet of Thomas Jolly and the people who put this on, knowing or being just willfully ignorant to the fact that this would be a source of a great deal of hurt and outrage and controversy. That's just not what the Olympics have historically been about, as I understand it. It seems to really go against the Olympic spirit. It goes against even Jolly's own depiction that he wanted this to be a message of inclusivity. This has been the least inclusive opening ceremony. There have been plenty of times, when they had the weird skeleton dancing in London for the opening ceremony there have been plenty of times where people were like, I don't get the artistic choices. But to see this much pain and outrage, that is a new low, it seems to me, in terms of opening ceremonies. So I think on that front, it's a shame that this is even an issue. On the more specific question of, does Jolly intend this to be the Last Supper or the Feast of the Gods? Is the Feast of the Gods itself an homage to or parody of the Last Supper? I think there's a lot of really good and complicated questions there. But I think I'd fall back to this. The opening ceremonies, this is not something that he just put together the night before. This was a 2-year-long process. And the idea that in those 2 years, you didn't think, hey, maybe if I'm trying to represent a pretty obscure Dutch painting and it looks a heck of a lot like the Last Supper, there are going to be a lot of people who assume that I'm trying to make fun of the Last Supper, and they're going to respond to that. And it's not going to be a positive experience for them or for us. To not care about how 2 billion Christians are likely to see the thing and respond to it shows either an indifference or, it's hard to say it's anything. Either you're trying to provoke them or you're just indifferent to how people are going to respond to your art. And so it's, at best, grossly negligent for everyone involved. But I think that's a really generous read. I think it's much more likely that they knew people would be upset about this and proceeded. I think it's just unfortunate.
Yeah, and what was Thomas Shirley, the choreographer, the entire presentation and stuff, what was he trying to do, and a lot of people have commented on this as well. Like, what was the intention? What sort of message was he trying to convey? And obviously, he was trying to convey a message, but he did it symbolically. So he's very aware of the symbolism of the things that he was depicting, and so it just raises a lot of questions. Like, if you're so familiar with, for example, a message that you could convey with the Greek god Dionysus, sitting on a table and in a platter, and all of these people surrounding him and stuff. And if you know that much, then it seems pretty likely that you knew that this looked at least similar to this other painting. And
it's hard to imagine someone who knows Feast of the Gods and doesn't know Da Vinci. Like, that is, it just seems like if you know who, I don't know, take it like an obscure quantum physicist is, and you don't know Albert Einstein, I've got questions, right? So like Da Vinci, arguably The Last Supper is the most famous painting on Earth, like the most famous painting in history. It's at least in the running for that. And so just to try this out, because I know when Christians got upset and said, you're making fun of the Last Supper, the response was, oh, you dumb, ignorant Christians, how did you not know this was the Feast of the Gods? Which is a ridiculous response. But just to test it, I asked ChatGPT, what is the painting that has a dinner and all of the people eating are seated around one side of the table? And it said, the painting you're thinking of is Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Like, it didn't have any question that, oh, if this is the kind of visual thing that you're describing, this is a nod to The Last Supper, or this is a depiction of The Last Supper by Da Vinci. So I think someone to not see that element, you do have to be a little bit willfully blind, or you have to kind of pretend you don't see that this is what it looks like. And prior to Da Vinci, I don't know of any, I've looked at several other older paintings of meals, and there are plenty. You get the Wedding Feast of Cana, you've got all sorts of wedding feasts and other like meal paintings. I don't know of another one where everyone is seated in that way. And then in the center, you have in Da Vinci, the Christ figure, in Feast of the Gods, presumably Apollos, with radiating light. In the case of Christ, a halo. That doesn't seem coincidental. Like, it's stylistically, they're too obviously similar that you can just be like, oh, what a weird coincidence.
Yeah, and some people pointed out, like, they had to be sitting in that way in order to, like, accommodate the bridge that they were on. And you might want to say that, but then the question is still going to arise, like, did he not know that the way that it sort of looked when they were doing run-throughs and right, rehearsals and stuff, like, did you not look at the camera feed and then see, oh, actually, that actually kind of looks like the Last Supper? We had to put everyone on that side, but we should probably maybe change things up a little bit because it kind of looks like it's going to be mocking Christianity. So maybe we need to change that. Like, even if
also, it's in French, there's a word play, because the word for like a scene and the word for Last Supper and the word for the river are all pronounced scene. And so you have the scene of the scene, like the scene of the supper on the scene. So it like the whole thing is really kind of punny in French if this is the Last Supper as a tableau on the river scene. Like, those things, like, what a weird coincidence if that isn't what meant. Like, that certainly seems like, and you've got things from people involved in it describing it that way. So then when there's a big outrage to say, oh, no, like, we didn't intend that at all, it obviously rings a little hollow. Now, I think a good artist can include kind of multifaceted references. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You might have very much in view both of these. That's completely reasonable. But to pretend like there isn't an element of the Last Supper consciously present here does stretch the limits of my credulity.
Let's do this now. Let's turn to a video that Jonathan Peugeot, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He just released this very interesting video in which he's talking about the symbolism behind the entire event. This clip is about 7 minutes long. We'll kind of pause and comment as we go through here. But I thought it was pretty interesting, and we'll talk about this. Joe, let me know if all the sound and everything is good once we start this.
All right, like one of the drives of the drag queen.
Whoops. I've got it.
It's fast, but I can hear it.
Yeah, let me change that a little bit. Hang on, guys. I listen to everything on double speed, so let me back up a little bit.
If there's people who go to listen to this on double speed, their minds are going to get blown here for a second.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's get this back to normal.
kind of drive, like one of the drives of the drag queen and a lot of the rainbow stuff is, of course, to replace the sacred with a new sacred, which is the sacred of ambiguity, a sacred of multiplicity, the sacred of difference. And these are all things that the people involved in these events and in this way of thinking are saying that they're doing themselves. So we have to just be aware that that's what's going on. Now, I do believe that it is destructive. Like, it is really in some ways undermining, right? Literally inverting, twisting. They use the word queering. It's queering Christianity in order to bring it into this new vision of reality. And so a good way to do it, for example, is to take the Last Supper and then replace it with an orgy, replace it with a bacchanalian festival, because it's not like there aren't certain analogies that you can make between the image of the feast, for example, the banquets of Dionysus and the Holy Communion. There are certain types of analogies that are there. Of course, in Christianity, it is in some ways a kind of bringing in of multiplicity into one. There is an aspect of the scandal in communion that I've mentioned before, which is this idea of eating the body of the God, but it is sublimated, right? It's transformed into a vector of unity where all things are kind of collected together. Now, a good way to subvert that is, of course, to bring back these kind of Dionysian party instead of a true communion. And, this presenting of the god Dionysus as the meal that we will enjoy in order to celebrate our diversity. Now, remember that in the stories of back...
I want to kind of pause here and talk about the fact that, in the Last Supper, we're talking about the body and the blood, right? It's about the bread and the wine. And then here it's being replaced with like another god, Dionysus, right? And so he's kind of drawn that parallel here.
Yeah, there's actually a long history of this, both in theology and philosophy and in art, where you have this kind of movement where you have people coming out of Judaism and out of paganism into Christianity. And there are certain thematic similarities between what's happening in the Christian Eucharist and what's happening in Jewish and pagan ceremonies. And St. Paul acknowledges this in 1 Corinthians 10, when he talks about how it is that we can participate in the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. He compares it to the sacrificial food offerings in the temple and the pagan sacrifices. And he says, I don't want you to eat at the table of demons and the table of the Lord. And so there is an implicit parallelism there between the Christian table, the altar, and the pagan table, which was an altar. And he says, I don't want you to drink of the cup of demons and the cup of the Lord. So it's not an equation, but it is a comparison. There is a certain likeness and a certain dissimilarity. The obvious dissimilarity being, as Paul says, what they offer to demons and not to God. And so the notion of like a Christian offertory meal in which we have communion with God is something that would make sense in a sacrificial framework in the ideas of like a first century Jew or pagan. So that means like then flash forward 1600 years or so, and you start to have this emergence of art kind of post-Renaissance where it sort of runs that comparison in the other direction, where it's depicting pagan scenes. I mean, the Renaissance, the Renaissance, like the rebirth, is a rebirth of Greco-Roman civilization in a real way. Like, so you have, you see this artistically. You get a lot of very strong Greco-Roman influences in art, but you also have the emergence of a lot more themes from Greek and Roman mythology, but they're being painted and depicted by people who are either Christian or at least grew up Christian and have a very kind of Christianized vision of religion and the world. And so when they want to tell a story like the Feast of the Gods, it's not shocking there that it would have strong thematic similarities to the Christian Eucharist. Because, I mean, think about who's painting these. Think about who's creating this. And so the connection is, I think, pretty understandable and pretty clear. And I should say at this point, not every depiction is a mockery. Like, not every depiction is a blasphemy. The fact that you're presenting pagan themes in a Christian style may not be you intending to mock or pervert Christianity. You may be just trying to depict a pagan subject matter in a way that, like, your artistic vocabulary and imagistic vocabulary is a heavily Christianized one. We'll probably talk about this more, but there is this weird kind of paradox where the more Christian a culture becomes, the more you see things like Christian blasphemy. And that sounds very strange and paradoxical, but I think we can show it. And so, ironically, as cultures become less Christian, you find them using religious blasphemy less often in kind of their utterances and everything else. But we're right now in this place where there's enough in the West cultural Christianity that people who want to subvert and undermine it have a language they can draw on. So, yeah, I think I would agree with that basic thesis that there is this attempt to mock Christianity by presenting these pagan parallels. And so you'll find, because we mentioned, Dionysus and Bacchus, there's sometimes claims that, Dionysus was also born of a virgin on December 25th and all these other like alleged similarities, and they're not true. But what it is a retelling of these pagan stories in a very Christian way, and then claiming Christianity is just like a knockoff form of this paganism, which historically is absurd, but is built on just not understanding Roman paganism kind of as its own thing.
Well, I was actually going to play this longer clip from Jonathan, but you guys can go watch the rest of it if you guys are interested. Just go to his YouTube channel; it's one of the most recent ones. The title is "Symbolism Explained: The Olympics Opening Ceremony is Worse Than You Thought." So if you guys are interested, go check that out. I want to move on because we've been talking about, like, are there similarities between what we saw at the Olympics and the Last Supper painting? And I think the answer to that is it's got to be yes. Like, even if they're denying it, there's some element there that if it wasn't intentional, then it was just gross negligence on their part. And it completely went against like their entire point of what they were trying to do. So I want to shift away from that and start to discuss the way that sort of Christians have responded, not just to this, but to other cases of mockery throughout the centuries. And I think this is where things are going to get very interesting, because it's, again, not very clear, at least biblically, like how Christians should respond to mockery. And actually what I want to do is pull up, I use ChatGPT a bunch for work and for the channel and stuff. And so I asked it, what is the most biblically grounded and effective way Christians should respond to mockery? And what I kind of typically use ChatGPT for is to kind of give me like an overview of different things that I may not have thought of. And so it gives basically, I'm not going to go through all of this here, but it gave 6 different responses. And some of these are literally inconsistent with each other in terms of like how you should actually respond. And so it's going to be almost like a case by case type of basis, the way that you should respond to a case of mockery or insult. And so that's, I think, what is kind of so complicated about this whole issue. And I think it's not just this, but it's also just ethics more generally. Like, ethics is difficult. Applied ethics especially is very hard. It's like sometimes it's really hard to know the right way to respond to something, the right way to react. And so in the Christian case, it's with respect to mockery, it's no easier. And so yeah, I just wanted to kind of point that out as we start to transition to talking about how Christians have responded.
About that. I think we're always looking for an easy shortcut. We're always wanting, so if you're familiar with even like philosophies like consequentialism, where you just weigh the consequences, the pros and the cons, and whichever one's better, you go with that. That simplifies ethics. It simplifies the process of discernment, and you don't have to carefully weigh.
Well, on the surface, at least.
Right. But that's kind of, I think, the appeal of the philosophy in a lot of ways, and it's always a kind of a false veneer. Like, you can't actually weigh effectively all of the consequences seen and unseen of your actions. You don't. Only God could possibly do that. What you're actually called to do is make a good faith assessment of, is this the right action? And am I doing it for the right reasons? Is it likely to have good outcomes? Those are harder questions to answer. Well, likewise, like, how should I respond to mockery? I think we would even want to say, how should I respond to mockery against myself, as opposed to, blasphemy, which is mocking God, mocking the sacred. That's going to be potentially 2 different answers. And then the last thing I'd say is, if you look at in John 11, Jesus, it's the death of Lazarus. Both Mary and Martha come to Jesus, and they say verbatim the same thing. Lord, if you'd been here, our brother would not have died. And when Martha says it, it's a theological objection. She's grappling with the reality of the resurrection in which she believes and trying to make sense of why this happened. And so Jesus talks to her theologically about the resurrection, that he is the resurrection and the life. In contrast, when Mary says verbatim the same thing, she says it while weeping. And so Jesus doesn't go on like a theological discourses with her. He cries with her. And so when we're asking questions like, how should I respond to this situation? I think the one rule is that you have to read the particulars of the situation. Like, what is this person doing? Why are they doing it? Because there are times where someone might say or do something that's like offensive, but they're not trying, like, they just don't understand. Like, it's an innocent mistake, or they're acting out of like an abundance of pain, and they might need someone to just be a genuine salve, or they're just being a jerk. And how you respond to those situations is probably not going to be the same in each case.
Yeah, so let's kind of bring up some of these clips, and I'm gonna let you kind of take the reins at this point, and kind of we have a bunch of clips lined up that we can kind of go through and talk about, but we can also just kind of go through the list of the different historical times that mockery has happened against Christianity and stuff. So I'll kind of let you take the reins now.
Yeah, I guess I would say when we're talking about blasphemy, we should recognize that blasphemy was a sin described as sinful in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is not something, I've already seen Christians be like, it doesn't matter. You're not actually hurting God with blasphemy. And that's a ice cold take. It is a terrible take. Blasphemy matters not because it hurts God. No sin hurts God. Like, by that reasoning, everything's okay. But blasphemy does hurt your relationship with God, and it does hurt your relationship with others. So you can create a kind of culture in which it does become harder to be Christian because you're creating a culture of derision and mockery. And Christians should care about the fact that people are actively making it harder to be Christian, making it less pleasant to be Christian. That's not good. And it's not something that we want to just kind of shrug off. Jesus warns in the days to come of men's hearts growing cold with charity because of the multiplication of wickedness. So the wickedness of men, even if it's not hurting God, does hurt, maybe Christians who are struggling in their faith, maybe the lukewarm, maybe those who are new Christians. You make it that much harder when you kind of make fun of the thing. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist. If, I had a new shirt that I got, and some people in the YouTube comments loved it, and some people absolutely hated it. And I thought it was hilarious because I knew it was an ugly shirt. But if I seriously loved that shirt and thought, oh yeah, this is really nice, and then everybody made fun of it, of course I'm going to be less likely to wear it. So likewise, if you've got a belief system and everybody's making fun of it, they don't even need to present an argument. The mockery and derision makes it that much harder to move forward. Now, should it? No. Does it? Of course. And so when we're talking about this, let's establish that at the outset, that the Old and New Testament alike present blasphemy as a serious thing. Like when Jesus says that all sins and blasphemies will be forgiven in the age to come except blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, he takes for granted that blasphemy is sinful and wrong. It's the sort of thing that needs to be forgiven. And only if we refuse to cooperate with the Holy Spirit, which is what we mean by blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, if we cooperate, then our blasphemies can be forgiven. If we don't, they won't be. So that's the first thing. Like, blasphemy matters. The second thing is what we define as blasphemy, what we describe as blasphemy, has always been a tricky issue to sort of define. And the easy way of seeing this is, for instance, in Mark 14, in verse 64, you may remember Jesus is condemned to death because he's accused of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God, claiming to be able to destroy the temple and in 3 days rebuild it, or if the temple is destroyed, he'll rebuild it in 3 days. All of this, he is condemned for blasphemy. So the fact that blasphemy is wrong, we have to then couple that with the biblical evidence that people can use charges of blasphemy in an unhealthy and unhelpful sort of way. Paradoxically, in the killing of Jesus Christ, you have the worst example of blasphemy. Think about speaking against. The word blasphemy comes from speaking against, like speaking against God or speaking ill of God. And you certainly have that happening in Jesus's condemnation. You also have just the incredible degradation of the scourging at the pillar, of the crowning with thorns, this parody of Christ as King. In the stripping, which is, I think it's fair to say, the stripping of Christ, we can even describe it as sexual violence. And it's clearly a sexualized degradation of Christ. This is blasphemous. And the crucifixion. And so if you think about it in that way, almost everything we see after that, in terms of artists trying to be provocative in terms of their blasphemies against God, there's plenty of examples as you go through the list of artists doing things, for instance, authors having sexualized visions of Christ on the cross. And all of that is gross and blasphemous, but all of that is already right there in the story of the sexual degradation and the physical degradation and the mockery. All of that blasphemy is already present there in the crucifixion. That does not make it okay, but it does mean that there's something very strange about the Christian reality here, which is that we enter into this. We don't run away from it. We don't just protest it. But as St. Paul says, we proclaim Christ crucified. That there is this kind of radical invitation to a response to present the gospel precisely in that we have a God who underwent this kind of humiliating death on our behalf.
So which one would you like to kind of take a look at first from a historical perspective? Because it's been happening for quite a while. I think one of the examples you gave me was from what, 200 AD?
Yeah, the Alexamenos graffito. Let's show that, because I think that's the blasphemy against Christians, it does continue, and you see it very early on right here.
All right, this clip is about a minute long.
It was an ancient and blasphemous bit of graffiti depicting a man worshipping a crucified figure with the head of an ass. Accompanying the image was the mocking inscription, Alexamenos worships his god. This image, apparently depicting a crucified and donkey-headed Christ, is...
First of all, I mean, it almost looks like a modern-day meme. It's wild how, like...
It does.
Yeah.
You're right. It's actually kind of astounding. I don't want to rank blasphemies. I think this is a better blasphemy than a lot of the modern stuff. Like the simplicity and really, the mimetic value of it, of just, your God's a donkey. And I think we actually lose some of the reality. Like at the time this is presented, crucifixion is still a thing. So people knew how gory and ugly crucifixion was. So to have, an ass-headed Christ is a pretty effective kind of slur and slander. And Christians... Yeah,
and I wonder if this... I'm looking here at the side. I'm wondering if that's supposed to be blood, or it's hard to...
Yeah, I wondered the same thing. Because the image is degraded enough that it's tricky to say, but it certainly appears that there is both a scourge mark on the upper shoulder and a piercing in the side, which, if that's right, shows actually a remarkable amount of knowledge about either the death of Christ or just about the way crucifixions work. But this is perhaps the earliest depiction of the crucified Christ, and it's a mocking one. It's a kind of a blasphemous mockery. So I think as we kind of grapple with the fact that society is less Christian than it used to be, it's worth remembering that like these things happened, and they happened at a time when Christians were pretty powerless to do a whole lot about it from like a legal standpoint, but they could just go ahead and move forward and proclaim the reality of Christ crucified, knowing that there are going to be people who responded to it in a mocking and sort of derisive sort of way. So I think one of the things it reminds us of is that none of this is particularly new, which again doesn't make it okay, but it does hopefully give us the strength to know like we've been here before and we've come out stronger for it.
Yeah, I'm wondering, was there any historical record of like the backlash from Christians in response to this?
Not to this particular one. So this one, I don't know, like in context, it was in what was basically a boarding house for Imperial page boys. So this is, imagine like bathroom graffiti. This was not something that like ordinary people would have just like seen on their way to work, but you probably have some Christian page boys in the mix who are already actually a pretty vulnerable class of people, if you know how the Romans often treated young boys. and the emperors in particular often treated young boys. These were boys who were probably preyed upon. And so this one was lost to history until like the 19th century. And only when they were doing excavations did they find it and realize that this was extremely ancient. Which might actually be telling evidence of a sort of absence. What I mean is that it would not shock me to learn that there used to be more of this kind of anti-Christian art, but that in places that then became Christian, the new Christian owners destroyed the, anti-Christian mockery. We certainly see evidence of that sort of thing happening in some of the written evidence. So one of the things that's frustrating when you're talking about like early non-Christian attestations to Christ is that Christian copyists didn't want to copy the really blasphemous stuff. And so they would either omit it completely or substitute something positive. And it's like, well, yeah, I get from a pious standpoint why you would do that. From a historical standpoint, it certainly makes it harder to know, what did Josephus actually say about Christ, or what did Tacitus actually say about Christ? And so I would suggest, just as a hypothesis, if people are willing to do that with like the written evidence when they're uncomfortable with, the blasphemy, it certainly stands to reason that if you have a building that, say, becomes a church or even a Christian house, and there's an older pagan anti-Christian inscription, that anti-Christian inscription is probably going to come down, because they're not worried about like what are archaeologists going to think 2,000 years from now. They don't want an image mocking Christ in their house or in their church. So there probably was a lot more of this kind of stuff, but because of the nature of Rome becoming Christian, I would venture that we've lost a lot of it.
Yeah, I'm wondering now if we should turn to Greek theater, because I think that's going to be a little bit more analogous to what we've seen from the Olympics.
I agree. Do you want me? You can show the clip, or I can just kind of describe.
This one is just the ancient Greeks and Roman theater.
Yeah, so if you want, this one, I think just having the visuals of what it looked like, I thought this was helpful. Right after this, he gives a little bit of an explanation of kind of the background of the Greek comedies. He doesn't talk about the mime plays particularly, but just to get people kind of the right visual cues. This one's, I think, about a minute long. Yeah,
and this again is just going to kind of show like what theater looked like back then, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to look at some examples. All right, here we go.
These comedies were referred to as fabulae palliatae, with their scenes usually set in urban public squares, and their stories based on set types of stock characters that usually wore masks and cloaks to indicate their role. It's from these ancient roots that masks have been adopted as symbols of theatre right up to modern times. The typical cast of characters of an ancient play included the adolescens amator, or the...
I actually think that's probably a good... Because I want people to kind of see that ancient Greek theater uses these kind of ridiculous masks. And, if you're familiar with the comedy and tragedy mask, those are holdovers from this. But they were intentionally these often kind of grotesque and over-the-top masks. Like, you wouldn't see the actor's actual facial expression, because you wanted ordinary people to know immediately upon seeing them, is this the hero? Is this the villain? Is this the love interest? And, this is immediately visually cued by which mask they're wearing. This is where the persona, the speaking through, that's where words like person and personality come from, because it's, what are you speaking through? So originally there's like a whole history of that. But one of the things that happened is they would often tell stories from their own mythology, which means that they were often having these pretty mocking depictions of Greek and Roman mythology. And so then when Christianity arises on the scene, they do the same thing. So Costas Paniatakis, in his baptism and crucifixion on the mimic stage, talks about this, how we don't have a ton of evidence of what the contents of these mime plays look like, because again, it's not as if Christians are going to keep them when they convert the empire, but we have several kind of clues about them. Number one, that there were a lot of Christians who wrote against them. So, for instance, Tertullian in the late 100s, early 200s, has De Spectaculis, or On the Show, which is largely his argument against theater. And people now think like, oh, how ridiculous those, puritanical early Christians. And it's like, no, no, no. Like the early theater that they're talking about was often incredibly lewd, often extremely blasphemous, and often deeply pagan. Like Tertullian makes the point that they're dedicated to Bacchus, they're dedicated to Venus. Like these are the gods of theater. And so they are in what are set up to look like pagan shrines. And then they're offering these things that are like equal parts entertaining and profane and blasphemous. And so Tertullian says, you will hate, O Christian, the things whose authors must be the objects of your utter detestation. So we would now make a remark about the arts of the theater, about the things also whose authors and the names we execrate. And goes on to say, we ought to detest these heathen meetings and assemblies, if on no other account than that there God's name is blasphemed, that there they cry to the lions against us, that from thence persecuting decrees are wont to emanate and temptations are sent forth. In other words, Tertullian understood that like mass media plays an important role in the formation of culture. This is something we would do well to remember. Like the shows we watch, the things we listen to, shape how we think. And he makes the argument that a lot of the anti-Christian animosity is coming from people watching these ludicrous kind of anti-Christian plays. And so in that kind of context, I think we make sense of a few different things. On the one hand, you have these early stories of actors who convert to Christianity in this remarkable sort of way, that they are pantomiming baptism or mocking crucifixion. And in their kind of exploration of this, end up having a moment of conversion where they come to believe that Jesus is the Christ and that these things that they're making fun of are actually true. And in many cases, convert and are martyred. So there are stories in both the East and the West about this. If you want, I've got a little excerpt from one of those stories on St. Genesius, who was an actor and playwright who had written a play mocking Christianity, but then ends up becoming a Christian himself. If you've got that, you've got that clip. It's like, oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, which
it's
one
like
fourth
confused. One down.
Okay.
Sorry, my bad.
Was it? No, not this guy, right? Oh, here it is. Here it is. Okay. I should probably put up the screen so you guys can see. There we go. All right. And let me see. How long was this one? Just
we can just do like a little bit of. I'll just jump in partway through. I mean, he's just telling the story of what happened, but
okay.
Diocletian traveled to Rome in the year 303. Genesius knew of the emperor's hatred of Christianity, and he thought he could advance himself by writing and performing in a play which mocked the church. Genesius decided the best way to write such a satirical play was to deceive members of the local Christian community into believing he wanted to join them, to become a Christian. So they accepted him into the catechumenate. That's a period of instruction for baptism. And during those months of instruction, he decided to make the claims that baptism washed away sin and brought the baptized into a new life in Jesus, the subject of this mocking play. He was going to mock them both on stage in front of Diocletian. But something happened. During this period of instruction in the Christian way of life, he found himself increasingly drawn to the Savior. He became conflicted. He finally left the catechumenate and rejected the claims of Christianity. And he went on to write that blasphemous parody of the Christian faith. And he performed it in front of the emperor to enhance his standing.
I can take the story from here if you want.
Yep.
I mean, as you might imagine from the fact that this is being told as a positive story, it is not just about a guy who pretends like he wants to become a Christian and then leaves with material for like a really scathing play. He, in the course of performing it, those doubts, those questions he has resurface. And he ends up announcing that he wants to become Christian, and then he wants to serve the true King of Kings rather than the Roman Emperor, and is then put to death. And this is like one of the stories told in the West, and there's several similar actor figures in the East. So I think it just points to the fact that this is something that early Christians were aware of, that they were being the subject of mockery. So in terms of how they reacted to it, let's maybe pivot to that.
Okay. Actually, you know what? Before you do that,
yeah.
let's do this. Let's take some super chats. We had
Okay,
a
great.
couple sent in. Yeah. This one is actually from a little while ago. This one is from today. T for Forshin says, I enjoy your channel's recent focus on current events and appreciate it. Love it. Do more of it. However, I miss the deeper, high quality content. Is it gone for good? The answer, well, first of all, thank you. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of new for us. We haven't really focused on these sort of recent event type things. Like really, I mean, every now and then we'll cover something like that. Usually it's been actually under the heading of gender issues with someone like Dr. Thomas Bogardus. And I do plan on bringing him back on actually, hopefully soon, to talk about some of the other stuff that's happened recently at the Olympics. But we've kind of shifted focus just temporarily on some of these current events, just because to me, I think there's a lot of overlap between what's going on right now in the world, in the political sphere, and just like the news cycle more generally. There's a lot of things that are going on right now that deeply overlap with our interest as Christians. And so I wanted to comment on that and bring it to light and then start the conversation so that we can start to hopefully tie some of this back into apologetics. Like if you guys have watched the recent videos that I've done, especially on the Olympics, like toward the end, I tried to get people interested to like, hey, actually, if people were convinced that Christianity is true, this type of stuff probably wouldn't be happening. And you know what, Joe, you just gave a really good example of that. Like the deeper I think you get into knowledge of Christianity, the harder it is to reject it. And obviously that's not true for everyone. Some people, the deeper they get, the more they want to reject it. Okay, so it's not sort of universally true. But nevertheless, I think it's very good. And that's why I do apologetics, is because I want people to know more about the reasons to think that Christianity is true. And so I'm trying to get people that are interested in these topics. And again, they definitely overlap with Christianity. I want people to discover apologetics through the kind of stuff that's going on right now. So we've also been, Capturing Christianity has been in very much an exploratory mode over the past couple years, and different topics and different things that are sort of out of the box topics for related to like apologetics. So in the past, like people just talk about different arguments for and against God's existence. And so I'm trying to find different ways to talk about stuff so we can get more people interested, more people talking about this. And sometimes you've got to cover topics that aren't necessarily like strictly apologetics related, but there's always a way to kind of tie it back in so that you can get people talking about these really interesting and deep topics that I think more people should be talking about. But to answer the question, Tifer, and I don't know if that's the right way to say your name, and you've sent in several super chats, so just let me know. Like send me a comment or something. Let me know how to pronounce your name. But no, we don't plan on just completely doing away with like the deeper philosophical content at all. Someone who I've actually been kind of paying attention to lately, of all people, is Dave Farina. So Dave Farina, Joe, do you know who that is?
Vaguely,
Farina,
I've seen some of his stuff, but I'm not a deep
Professor Dave is his name on YouTube. He's got a very interesting model. I was looking into his YouTube channel, and so what he does is like I think maybe once a week he'll produce one like obviously viral type video where he's like deriding someone or making some really controversial claim or making fun of somebody, whatever it is. It's like clearly meant to go viral, and it does go viral. He'll get like millions of views on those videos. But then the rest of the time during the week, he's releasing these more like helpful kind of like videos for students that are trying to learn chemistry and stuff. And those videos don't get anywhere near the amount of views. They get like maybe 2,000 to 6,000 views because it's very specific and focused, and it's just the click-through rate on those is going to be tiny. So I've been actually kind of paying attention to that model that he's got there, where he's including like the viral type videos with the more deeper type level intellectual content, and kind of doing both that way. It's a bit of a risky strategy, but it's something that I'm considering and looking into. But more generally, like we have plans to do a lot more with Capturing Christianity in terms of the topics that we discuss. So we will continue to discuss the more philosophical and deep topics, and I don't plan on ever completely abandoning those. If we do talk more about current events, it will be for a temporary time. Or if we talk about other topics, it will probably be for a temporary time, and then we'll start to introduce other topics. I feel like I'm going long on this question, but I wanted to give people
maybe
a little
if I
bit
could
of
tie that
insight.
back into this topic. I think one of the things that intrigued me about kind of your pitch to do this episode was that you weren't just interested in kind of the hot take, what do you make of the Olympics? Like, certainly that's part of what we discussed, but the plan is always like, let's go one level deeper in kind of the how should we respond, and then another level deeper in like how have Christians historically responded? Like, what's kind of the 2,000-year history of blasphemy and Christian response, and kind of what can we make of that? Like, do we want to do what they did? And because they've responded in different ways in different contexts, some of those responses seem a lot better than others. I think you're adding a level of depth to it just in terms of the question that you're asking that I like. I like that you're not just totally scandal of the day, but are maybe taking whatever the news is and taking a little depth to that.
Yeah, and I think you've got to kind of do that. I mean, that was one of the actual takeaways from Tim Keller is I read his book years ago on preaching, and his book really emphasized that in every single passage that you discuss in the Bible, there's some way to draw it back to Christ. It doesn't matter what it is. Any passage that you're talking about, there's a way to draw it back to the cross. And so I've kind of been thinking about that in relation to apologetics, how we do apologetics on YouTube and on blogs and everything else. There's always a way to take almost any topic that you're going to talk about and tie it back into apologetics and tie it back ultimately back into Jesus. And so I think really what it comes down to is that people just aren't really thinking about that. They aren't necessarily even creative enough, or they're not trying to tie it back in. And so it's not easy to do, but that's something that I'm thinking about and trying to do. So
yeah, I mean, if Pascal is right that everyone is motivated by the desire for happiness, and then this explains every intentional human behavior, even including suicide, he says that this is all in pursuit of happiness, then we have a framework in which to say, okay, why is this person doing what they're doing? And how is Christ the answer to whatever decision they've made, good or bad? I heartily agree with that.
One other thing I'll just mention before we move on is that when it comes to the specific topics that are sort of open to people that are interested in the deeper intellectual things, you might think that it's very limited to just these really deep, philosophical papers or academic papers that are published and peer-reviewed and everything. You might think that that's the extent of what intellectual Christians can discuss. My views on that have changed over the years. I'm thinking now, like it almost doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's related to the truth of Christianity. There's a way to approach that in an intellectual way. And it may not seem like it on the surface, but that's ultimately what we want to do, is love God with all of our minds. And that's ultimately the point. And so as long as we're discussing these things as best we can intellectually, then I think that's the best that we can hope for. And again, I think it goes beyond this very specific set of topics that we're sort of allowed to discuss as intellectuals, which I don't even really necessarily consider myself an intellectual anyways, as someone who, like, my background is in photography. So, but yeah, and then last thing I wanted to mention is that we're going to, if we're doing any kind of shift at all, we're actually shifting into discussing, as it relates to apologetics, specific miracle cases. We're in the midst of starting a new YouTube channel focused on different documentaries, or focused on videos that are shot or filmed in a documentary style. We're going to be covering different miracle cases. It's going to be super fascinating. We've already gotten pretty deep in some of these, and you guys just need to wait and see what's going on. I think it's a lot of stuff we do here kind of revolutionizes the game, and people start to kind of copy what we do as we start to do it. Initially, it's kind of met with pushback and skepticism, and then everyone kind of starts doing it after a while. I think that's just how things go when you introduce something new.
I'm taking notes right now.
But yeah,
I'm gonna steal all this. No, I'm just kidding.
All right, let's move on to some more super chats. We've got a couple more, and then we'll get back to what we were talking about earlier. How Christians have responded. So Randall Chase says, should we expect the fallen world to act like believers? Jesus wasn't only mocked, but killed, and he said we shouldn't expect any less. John 15:20. Do you want to take this one, Joe?
Can I respond? Yeah. It depends what we mean by the word expect. Because expect could be like, I anticipate this thing's going to happen. Like if you say like you have expectations for your kids, you could mean you have standards, or you could mean you have predictions, and those don't always match up. Like if I give my now 3-year-old crayons and send him up to his room. I expect he will draw on the walls. That is not the expectation, though, in terms of the standards to which we call him. So if we're talking about the fallen world, I don't think we should have the expectation that they treat Jesus as the Christ if they don't believe that. But there is a basic standard of dignity that you can reasonably demand. Like, I don't think, when I see outraged Christians, I don't see them saying, why did you open the Olympics with a ceremony mocking this rather than an opening church service? I don't hear that. I don't hear them saying, we want to impose our vision. You know, we wanted you to do the Passion of the Christ as the opening ceremony. No, not that at all. Like, that's not what we're calling people to. It's a much lower standard that's being sought, which is just, don't be an ass. Like, don't intentionally mock something that somebody else finds sacred. Now, on one level, this would be true even if it wasn't Christianity. You know, so if the opening ceremony was Muhammad in drag, I don't think you would have to be a Muslim to say, that's gross and insensitive. You did not need to do that. This is not something that belonged in the Olympics opening ceremony. And that would be true even as a non-Muslim. Like, I can say as a non-Muslim, I would find that wrong. And I would hope even a non-Christian can look at, you know, mocking Jesus and replacing him with a drag queen is obviously insulting and not the sort of thing that should be done. Like, this is, on one level, just calling people to basic human dignity and treating other people with the same, rather than expecting them to behave as if they're personally devout. Like, there's a way of handling other people's beliefs with which you disagree. And so if that's even my expectation in terms of what is something reasonable someone could be called to, I'd say we can expect more from people. If you just mean, what do I predict will happen in terms of the cycles of, you know, provocation and outrage? Yeah, I predict people looking to make a name for themselves and looking to go viral will continually try to find new and interesting ways of making fun of Christianity, hoping that people will be outraged enough that it'll draw a spotlight to them, but not so outraged that it leads to any kind of actual pushback.
So let's do this. Actually, there was a super chat. We'll get the super chat on the screen, and then we'll turn to the verse that they mentioned here. Decent Fellow says 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 13 applies. No, so I've got that pulled up here for us to read through. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would not need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. So yeah, their question is, does this have any applicability to the situation?
I think there's two ways of interpreting what's going on there. The first is actually really relevant. So I mentioned before we went to the super chats that early Greek, or well, Roman at this point, but Greco-Roman theater had these mimic plays, making fun of the crucifixion, making fun of baptism, and in general, just being pagan and gross and lewd and blasphemous. In response to it, one of the things that the early church did was they forbade Christians from becoming actors, which sound like you need that context to understand how the theater was to realize why. So the Council of Arles in 314 and Canon 5 excommunicates theatrici, actors. And the Synod of Laodicea in the mid-300s likewise prohibits clergy from watching plays at weddings and feasts. The language in Canon 54 is, the higher and inferior clergy shall not join in witnessing any dramatic performance at weddings or feasts, but before the actors appear, they shall rise and go. So that's, I think, one of the first ways we respond is just like, get this stuff out of your life. Like, don't associate with the sexually immoral. This is very much what St. Paul is telling you to do in 1 Corinthians 5. Like, clean your own house. And so if you've got Christians who are performing these kind of plays or are inviting people to perform them at their weddings, those kind of things, like, don't associate with that. And so it's actually kind of remarkable how modest this reply is. They don't excommunicate everybody who goes to the plays. They don't even seem to excommunicate like the couple that invites actors to come and perform at their wedding reception. They just make sure that the clergy are not there to witness these displays that are unseemly, and they prohibit Christians from partaking in them as actors. So I think that's a good example of them trying to apply 1 Corinthians 5 in practice. Like if sexual immorality is being kind of paraded and displayed, have nothing to do with that. Now, the other way 1 Corinthians 5 is sometimes employed is is it not those inside the church you are to judge? God judges those outside. To say like, whatever happens in the broader world, that's the world's problem. We just need to make sure the church is doing okay. That's not a very, well, for one, I would suggest that standard becomes pretty much impossible in a democracy. Like when you have to actually make decisions in political life, and it becomes pretty impossible to just shrug off the world to the extent you have any kind of role to play, whether it's as a consumer or as a voter or as an elected representative or anybody who's making a decision. If you're, deciding to bring someone or not bring someone on, or give someone your money or not give someone your money, you do have to concretely make those decisions. This is not really about policing the morality of others, but there is a way in which we can and do care about the broader culture, because, as I mentioned before, when sin multiplies, the hearts of many grow cold from charity. That if you have a really ugly and negative culture, it becomes that much harder to live a virtuous Christian life. And so we cannot be indifferent to those outside the church. We cannot be indifferent to the broader culture, both for their sake and also for our own.
All right, let's turn to the Christian response to what we were discussing earlier. I've actually forgotten the examples, so you'll probably have to remind me and the audience.
Yeah, so you've got these mime plays. They're doing parodies of baptism and crucifixion, and as we just heard, the responses are to prohibit actors from continuing to act. Like if you're an actor and you become Christian, you are required to leave your profession, and you're not allowed to go back upon pain of excommunication. And the clergy aren't allowed to watch the performances. So it strikes me that it's a sort of modest claim, because remember, we're still in the early church. Christianity doesn't have a great deal of political power. Christianity by the mid 300s has been legalized, but it's not the official religion of the Roman Empire yet. And so the Christians are dealing in this world in which Christianity is clearly in the ascendancy. Paganism is clearly on the decline, but they still have to grapple with the fact that there's strong cultural elements that are deeply pagan and often pretty contemptuous of Christianity. And they respond to what I think is a pretty healthy way of having this measured response of saying, we're not going to participate in that. We don't want anything to do with it. And so that goes from Tertullian warning Christians not to have anything to do with the theater on forward. When in response to the 1 Corinthians 5 question, one thing I didn't mention, but is probably worth reminding, is Tertullian makes the point that a lot of anti-Christian persecutions are sort of stirred up in the theater context. And this makes sense. If you look at, people always get upset when you mention things like the Holocaust. I'm not suggesting a literal equivalency, but the role of the arts in promoting anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred in Nazi Germany was not incidental and unintentional. There's a department of propaganda, and you have the German state collaborating with filmmakers to make anti-Jewish films. And so if you were Jewish in this context, you wouldn't just shrug it off and say, God judged the outsiders. They're not Jews, so we don't care. Because you should realize that this is directly going to come back on your house. Well, likewise, as Christians, we don't want to be indifferent to the fact that people are not just being sexually immoral, but are being openly hostile and mocking of Christianity. They've made it an issue about us by bringing us into the equation. So I think, again, there's a pretty measured, pretty reasonable response, but the Christians of this period realize that they have to care about the state of the arts. They have to care about what's going on in the theaters, because it's corrupting to our souls and it's making a worse environment in which to live.
Yeah, I think that also kind of mimics a way that Christians, a lot of Christians feel about the current Olympic situation. Is a lot of people are just like, let's just not even care about it. Let's just not even worry about it. Let's just forget about it and move on with our lives. And I think a lot of Christians have that sentiment. Now, I'm not really sure I don't want to speculate too much on like the motivations behind why people have that sentiment. But I guess I see some similarities between the way that people are kind of responding now. I guess a good portion of Christians and how Christians have sort of responded in the past is like, let's just not be a part of it and just sort of stay out of it. Like, we'll just, y'all have your thing. Y'all can go and do your little presentations on, your Olympic opening ceremonies on whatever you want to whatever you want to do. And then we'll just be over here in church and enjoying ourselves over here. And so, yeah, I mean, because I doubt a lot of those Christians would be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go participate in that or be on stage with them.
Right.
Maybe there were some people who identified as Christians that were on that stage.
It would be interesting to find out. I mean, because sometimes you'll find out, so in the case of Serrano, who we might talk about in a little bit, he claims to be Christian as he's making these apparently blasphemous depictions of Christ, like putting a crucifix in a jar of his own urine. He claims this is like an homage to Christ. It is a bizarre claim, and I think he's being a little disingenuous with it. But you will find people who do claim to be Christian and are nevertheless participating in things that are objectively blasphemous. And so there, I do think the church has a role to say, like, no, don't do that. Like, you can't do both of these things. I think
just even on prudential grounds, it just doesn't seem like a good idea. Like, it's not, that's not going to draw you closer to Christ. And that's kind of like the point of what we're doing here on earth, is to grow closer to Christ. And if that's not going to help you do that, probably don't do it.
I don't know any actors, in Hollywood. I've known plenty of stories of actors who, present themselves as Christians and then still are in things that appear to be the offensive, controversial, even blasphemous. And you kind of shrug and think, like, why did you think that was okay? Like, why did you think that was an acceptable kind of thing to do? And I think the early Christian response would be to tell them, you can't do that. Like, you cannot act in a way that's going to be kind of vulgar and vicious and vicious in the sense of not virtuous, and blasphemous and contemptuous. And so whether that's a direct like mimic play or whether it's just like the other kind of vulgar things that would happen in ancient theater and in modern cinema, I think it's something to spiritually be attuned to. Now, I also think we can learn from the early Christians in knowing when to just tune it out. And I mean tune it out in both senses of like, you don't have to get outraged over every provocation. They're wanting you to get outraged for their own clicks. But also, don't have a media diet that consists of things that are gross and offensive. Like, one thing that the New Testament is really clear on is the kind of things we should focus on and fixate on. And it's not, let me find the most outrageous and vulgar kind of thing. So I guess I'd put it this way. If you couldn't show like your Netflix queue and your internet history to your pastor without being deeply uncomfortable, you probably aren't going to want to show them to God on Judgment Day. And yet we know we'll be judged for those kind of things. So there is this kind of, in kind of the broader theme of cleaning your own house, what are we consuming? What are we supporting with our eyes and with our dollars? And is it something that gives glory to God, or is it something that detracts from God? I think that's the first kind of set of answers and a good place to start in how we think about it.
So how about we mention this article really quickly?
I
think it's
so. A lot of what I
topic.
was drawing this from is this article called "Baptism and Crucifixion on the Mimic Stage," which has a pretty fascinating history of kind of looking at this. And one of the things they point out is that gods and religious affairs were a favorite topic of derision already from the time of what was called Old Comedy. And in the 4th century BC, so this is not even mocking Christianity, this is mocking their own gods, when the motif of mythological burlesque seems to have been extremely popular, and the frock is portrayed on the phalanx vases of the south of Italy, a type of drama akin to the mime. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, and Hermes are subjected to comically irreverent treatment. So one thing I think people don't understand about Roman paganism is that the Romans never seemed completely convinced that their gods existed. So it gets a little complicated. I mean, because this is true of the Greeks as well. But there is, I'm blanking on, is it Protagoras? Has On the Gods, in which he announces his agnosticism on whether the gods exist or not. And some later authors claim that he's exiled from the city for it, although we don't actually have any evidence of that from his own lifetime. People seem to just kind of accept kind of an open agnosticism about maybe these are all just stories that we're telling. The fact is, I mean, this is something I think people don't get about the mythos of Greco-Roman theater, is they were pretty openly just making up stories about the gods that they thought were interesting. So you would have completely contradictory sort of stories that couldn't both historically be true and told in this kind of once upon a time fashion. And that was acceptable. But some of these stories would present the gods as incompetent, or they would, present them in really degrading sort of ways. And, Zeus is notoriously a womanizer. And you have all of these depictions of divinity that were totally normal in that culture, but don't play well at all when you become Christian. Like, you don't want to present God the Father as basically a form of Zeus, this kind of gross and all too human, powerful deity. That's kind of the background people are coming from. But then that article goes on to talk about how we don't know when and where the first mimic performance began in terms of Christianity, but we do know that early Christians responded to it. And I've already quoted some of the responses, but I wanted to give one more cited in this article from St. Gregory Nazianzus, who talks about, he talks about how one of the controversies he was in had already been turned into a play in his day. So people were making fun of him for like an actual personal tragedy he had gone through. And then he lamented, "Moreover, we've already appeared even on the stage. When I say this, I'm almost crying, and we are laughed at along with the most licentious people. For no entertainment for the ears and eyes is so pleasant as a Christian ridiculed in comedy." That one thing I think we have to be mindful of is that Christianity has a seriousness that paganism didn't have. And it has a seriousness precisely because we think the things we're saying are true and that they're sacred. And so it's easy to be a scoffer and it's easy to be derisive in a sort of almost nihilistic sort of way, where you just laugh at everything and laugh at the nature of reality. And the Christian response is not to just like laugh along with it or to adopt that sort of attitude towards the world. It's to realize that some things shouldn't be the subject of mockery. I've heard many Christians give some version of the idea like, well, if Christianity is true, we should be able to joke about it. And it's like, why is that the standard? Like, if the standard is this thing is true, therefore blasphemy should be okay, I don't understand what internal logic kind of gets to that conclusion. The early Christians seem to take the other approach that if Christianity is true, there's some things you don't laugh and joke about. Like you don't laugh about like the persecution of Christ and of Christians. That's not like a joke. That's a tragedy. That's a real thing that happens. And so I'm reminded here actually of a Flannery O'Connor short story where I believe it's called The Kingdom of God, but I don't remember offhand. It's a boy who comes from a non-religious household who goes to stay with like an elderly babysitter who ends up taking him down to watch baptisms in the river. And he learns about Jesus, who has a kingdom, as he understands it, under the sea, because, the baptism's there in the river and they're talking about the kingdom of God. And he has this moment of revelation of realizing that Jesus refers to a person where he thought it just meant wow or damn. And I love that treatment because it shows like this boy is suddenly attuned to the fact, oh, there's something richer than just kind of this derisive mockery that he'd been accustomed to, where the name of Jesus isn't just a curse word the way that he'd kind of heard it used as. So tying that back, if I may, to the Olympic situation, one of the explanations for the opening ceremony is that it's about coming out of kind of closed-mindedness represented by the Last Supper and Christianity more broadly into a place of liberation. This is the kind of queering of Christianity idea and this is represented by the pagan festivities. And I would suggest that historically, this gets things all wrong in a way that I think is very interesting. So I keep kind of alluding to the fact that Christianity is in the Roman Empire and that the Roman Empire is becoming more and more Christian and paganism is on the decline. And there's a popular version of that story that this is just a matter of, internal persecution. Oh, Constantine became Christian and Christianity became legalized, and so pagans were just doomed. That is a weak historical story. And one of the reasons it's weak is if official approval of Christianity is all it took for Christianity to win and paganism to lose, why was that not also true before that or after that with Julian the Apostate, when paganism was the official religion of the Roman Empire and Christianity was outlawed? Why didn't Christianity go away and paganism thrive? And Bart Ehrman, of all people, ex-Christian, biblical scholar, makes a pretty convincing argument in his book, The Triumph of Christianity, that the twofold reason that Christianity wins in the Roman Empire is because of, number one, a Christian culture of evangelization, and number two, this culture of exclusivity, that the Christian response shouldn't just be, there are many ways to God, all these ways are equally valid, this is just our preferred one, that it is precisely because Christians refuse to play that game that they succeeded. So I don't know if you want to play, there's a short, maybe 30-second clip from
let's play that
Ehrman.
clip.
Okay.
But when you have a religion that believes in trying to converting people to their view and insists that their view is the only right view, that combination of evangelism and exclusivity has a very powerful effect. There was nothing like it in the empire, but it meant that over time, as people did come to the Christian faith, they were leaving all the other faiths. Unlike the other faiths, where the other religions, if a lot more people start worshiping Apollo, it doesn't stop people from worshiping Zeus. But if you become Christian, you stop being pagan. And it has this interesting effect that most people wouldn't have thought of, that McMullen makes a deal of, that I think he's absolutely right. And so just as an analogy, he doesn't quite put it this way, but as an analogy, suppose you and I are both gung-ho for our particular religion. And you are a Christian who believes that Christ is the only way, that the God of Jesus is the only God. And I'm a worshiper of Apollo, and I think Apollo's great. But Apollo's, people ought to worship Apollo. And suppose this would never happen because pagans were not missionaries. But suppose you and I go into a town and we get a group of about 100 people, and all of them are pagan. They worship various gods, but none of them worships Apollo, and none of them worships Jesus or the God of Jesus. And so suppose we both give a presentation, and suppose we're equally convincing. Okay, we're equally convincing. If we are equally convincing, then out of that 100 people, Christians gain 50 converts and lose no one. Paganism loses 50 people and gains no one. And so,
okay, so I think you can kind of get but he's making the argument that Christianity succeeds precisely because it has a higher call. And I think that this is historically well documented, that people are being told to give up everything to follow Christ. And so what might look to Thomas Jolly or to many modern people as kind of the rigidity and the prison of Christianity, and they need to be liberated into the freedom of a bacchanalia, of the freedom of just like a pagan, orgiastic, open-ended, you do you kind of spirituality. The actual pagans, like the real people who believed in that stuff, were so unsatisfied by it that when Christianity came along with this radically different message, they converted en masse. Like they converted in huge numbers at an incredible rate of growth until the Roman Empire, with very few state persecutions, was overwhelmingly Christian. And paganism just died out. You do not see ancient paganism, it went completely extinct, which is astonishing given the number of people who once upon a time held to it. And they were persuaded, I think Ehrman is right, by those two factors. So I want to present that as kind of a counter vision, but it suggests that this becomes really relevant in the context of blasphemy. Because when you have the kind of non-exclusive view of God, like Apollos is great, but maybe you've got some other God and kind of you do you, the stakes are relatively lower. If you want to worship Apollo today and Hera tomorrow and Zeus the next day, fine, whatever. And so in that world, you can kind of subject the gods to mockery because none of them really claim anything like a real lordship. But the Christian claim is that we take this seriously precisely because Jesus is Lord. in a way that those Roman gods didn't even really claim of themselves. Like, no one was making claims about the Roman gods of the sort that Christians were claiming about the Christian God. So that really changes, I think, how we think of things like mockery. So anyway, that's a lot of time on the early church. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, no. I was going to say, why don't we cover maybe one more example and then kind of wrap things up, just because we've been going a while and it's a little bit difficult on the migraine. So let's try to wrap things up soon. I do have one thought that kind of occurred to me I don't even know if it's necessarily pushback at all, but let me just give it to you, and then I'll get your response to it, and then we'll turn to one more example of mockery against Christians and how Christians have responded to it. So Jesus is, our prime example of how we should live and how we should conduct ourselves. And the way that Jesus responded to mockery seems to almost be very pacifist. So like he's being accused in front of Pilate and stuff, and what does he do? He's basically just silent. And people are mocking him, and he's just kind of like silently taking it. And then when he's on the cross, everyone is mocking him, and he's like literally dying and being crucified. And then his response is, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And so I can see why a lot of Christians will want to say, well, Jesus is our example. How did he respond to that kind of mockery, especially in like this was like the sort of climax of his ministry and life and everything, and that's when the mockery was at its worst, when he was being like crucified in the passion narrative and everything. So if that's how Jesus responded, and I think what sort of drives the people that want to say, well, when it comes to mockery, we should be a lot more vocal about it. We should want to respond to it and do away with it, because kind of like what you said earlier, it's like if we don't do anything, then we're going to be creating this culture that where mockery is okay, and that's going to lead ultimately to fewer people coming to Christ. And so it's for these very practical reasons that we want to say, well, we just take some kind of stand against it. We got to say something about it. But you could also apply a similar argument in the case of Jesus. Like if you were watching him being accused in front of the Jewish officials and in front of Pilate, you could be like, Jesus, why are you not responding to what they're saying against you? And do you realize if you do this and you're our example, you're going to create a culture where it's okay to mock, and you got to be silent, right? And so you can kind of see how like that argument wouldn't necessarily really touch what Jesus is doing here. And so, what are your thoughts on that for people who want to use Jesus as an example? When
Jesus is being mocked, this is, on the one hand, the mockery of God, and on the other hand, a model for how we should respond when we are mocked. And when we are treated poorly, we have pretty clear instructions to turn the other cheek. On the other hand, when it's something like the desecration of his father's house, you have the cleansing of the temple, or you have the Pharisees blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, and he sharply rebukes them. We do find Jesus has a real zeal for his father's house, as he announces in John 2. And we find that he announces in one of the accounts of the cleansing of the temple. I don't remember if it's John 2 now that I say that. And then he clearly denounces blasphemy against the Holy Spirit as an unforgivable sin. All that's to say, Jesus does treat blasphemy against the Father and the Spirit very seriously, even as he sort of allows it to happen to him with a spirit of meekness and humility. That, I think, shows something slightly different is going on there. He makes it very clear, in his arrest, he could have the Father send a legion of angels to protect him. He's not saying like sacred things don't need to be defended or protected, or there shouldn't be zeal. There's nothing like that. Rather, it is part of the plan of providence for all time that the Father would give the Son to lay down his life for the world. And so he's cooperating with that plan, which is really a reflection of the sovereignty of God to undergo even these humiliations out of love for us. So it is a special set of circumstances. And I would suggest, if we want something analogous to our own situation, it's less like people insulting us and more like people insulting our God. And so looking at how Jesus responds to insults against the Father or against the Spirit may be more instructive in showing us how we ought to respond. But nevertheless, I think that we should look at both sets of evidence, because there are times where I think we should learn to shrug things off and realize people maybe aren't intending to be insulting, and maybe we do need to just turn the other cheek and move forward.
Well, there's actually one of my mentors has suggested, like, if you've got any kind of like YouTube channel, it doesn't even have to be on anything related to apologetics, but you're going to get people that make response videos and will say negative things about you. There's even a whole thing right now, I'm sure you've probably seen it, about Mr. Beast and how he's engaged in some pretty nefarious behavior, especially people that have been on his staff and stuff. And so it's bound to happen once you start to get a little bit of influence on social media. But one of my mentors has pointed out, like, you can either respond to them, or one option would be to just be silent about it, and just you don't necessarily have to respond. And if you don't respond, well, according to my mentor, and I think that this is true, it almost exudes a kind of strength is the term that he used. It almost exudes a kind of strength. And I think that's what we see in the case of Jesus. Like, so that's, and I say all this almost to just say that it is very complicated to know.
It is.
Exactly
there are times where
the type of response.
The right way to go, where someone's going to make a mocking and derisive comment, and you can reply to it without, or not reply to it without it appearing like you're going along with it, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, and there are practical reasons to be like, okay, we got to say something about this, right? We've got to, we can't just let this happen, otherwise it's going to taint the culture. And make it even more difficult to become a Christian. But then on the other hand, some people are seeing the way that Christians are reacting, and they're like, those guys are way too sensitive. Like, right. This wasn't even about Christianity. And so, like, I don't want to be part of that, because they're just like, they're way too sensitive. So I can see it kind
I guess I would stand
ways.
for the proposition that we shouldn't fall into kind of quietism or pietism. Like the idea of like, we're just going to do our own thing. We're going to be separatists from everybody else. But we also don't need to be constantly engage in every cultural fight that is offered to us. We don't have to take every argument. We don't have, and that's true both on an individual level. I'm sure you don't respond to every negative YouTube comment, but maybe some of them are thoughtful and worth responding to, or you're worried it's going to convince someone else and you respond to it. But you have to know when to just ignore it or let it go. And putting more attention on it actually only does worse things. I mean, when we were preparing this episode, we had to think like, well, do we want to even show kind of blasphemous images that mock Christianity, or does that undermine what it is we're trying to do here? That kind of discernment is something that I think is invaluable in deciding kind of what you're going to do in response. If I may, I want to say two final kind of quick examples. One of them will be, I'll make sure it's very short, because I've talked exclusively about the early church. But eventually, of course, Christianity becomes the dominant religion. You have Christendom. You have Christianity as the state religion, both in the Roman Empire and then a bunch of nation states throughout Europe. And in that time, like during the Middle Ages, you have on the one hand, St. Thomas Aquinas arguing blasphemy is in fact the worst sin, worse even than murder, because the opponent of it isn't your neighbor, but God himself. But nevertheless, that murder takes precedence when it comes to punishment, because you are actually doing worse damage to your neighbor than you're doing to God. Like, even if you try to insult God, you're not going to actually hurt his feelings. And so one of the things I was surprised by in the treatment of this was that blasphemy laws, so Gerhard Schwerhoff looks at the period 1200 to 1650 and says that blasphemy laws tended to be enforced pretty lightly, that even though you could be threatened with things like capital punishment, most of the time there was minor punishment or no prosecution whatsoever, even though blasphemy occurred at kind of all levels of society. And so we have a rich vocabulary of Old English, pretty shocking blasphemies. And I won't recount all of them, but I would say even the fact that we talk about them as curse words or swearing refers to the fact that one of the ways people used bad language in the past was by taking sacrilegious oaths. That's the swearing part of swearing. Or they would use divine language, sacred words, in curses. They would curse God. Like, this is something Christians in the Middle Ages would do when they would get angry. And they would largely be unpunished. They would just be, the priests would tell them to stop doing that. And so if you have an image that the Christian Middle Ages where, something like Pakistan, where you could be arrested for blasphemy and there, kind of a fear of saying the wrong thing. The evidence doesn't seem to actually point that way. And I was actually struck by how little it pointed that way. But eventually, just as Christianity has a rise in terms of, political power, it also has a fall. And so in the 19th century, you have things like the French Revolution, late 1700s, early 1800s. You've got the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon, the rapid secularization of France in particular. And in there, all sorts of shocking kind of blasphemous actions, like taking French churches and putting an idol to reason in Notre Dame or in various other churches and creating a new state religion that is atheistic. And then, all of this stuff that it was overtly and shockingly sacrilegious, and which still shapes a lot of French society where religion is not nearly as overt as it is even in the US. In response to that, there was a real push for a theology of what we might call reparation. And so theologically, it's this idea, St. Paul talks about this in Colossians 1, about making up. He says, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And in my flesh, I complete what is lacking in Christ's affliction for the sake of his body, that is the church. That is, we are called to share in the suffering of Christ. Like Christ says, if anyone would follow me, take up his cross and follow me. That we share our crosses united with the cross of Christ for the good of others. That even as Christ on the cross can plead for the blasphemers and say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Christians take this role of, okay, we need to be making reparation for the blasphemous. And this, I think, is solidly good advice. This is a very good direction. So to give just one example of this, there's a French nun, a Carmelite nun, from the 19th century, Sister Mary of St. Peter, and she composes a prayer in response to blasphemy. And the prayer isn't, let me strike down the blasphemous or anything like this, or, God seek vengeance upon them. It's not looking for like a state solution of we need to outlaw this or do anything like that. It is simply, may the most holy, most sacred, most adorable, most incomprehensible and ineffable name of God be forever praised, blessed, loved, adored, and glorified in heaven, on earth, and under the earth by all the creatures of God, and by the Sacred Heart of our Lord Jesus Christ in the most holy sacrament of the altar. Amen. I love this response. I love this idea that even though we don't know, when do we need to take the fight? When do we need to say something publicly? What should, should people lose their job over certain blasphemous actions? All that stuff can be really complicated case by case, but knowing like this is a good time to pray for the other person and to make a prayer just praising God and the goodness of God, that's a really good, solid kind of answer. So like practically, like if I'm in a conversation with somebody or I'm watching something and somebody takes the Lord's name in vain, I try to just take a quick moment, make a really quick prayer, and just like, okay, if you're going to mention the name of Jesus, great, I'm going to give glory to Jesus. And it's something you can do silently, and you can just make those little acts of reparation as a really concrete way of responding to the problem of blasphemy.
What about Andres Serrano? Should we talk about him before we?
I wanted to respect your kind of your migraine, but by all means, this is a really famous 1987 depiction, and I alluded to it before. It's a picture of a crucifix in a jar of Serrano's own urine, but here he is talking about it, trying to claim that that all of his apparently sacrilegious art is really coming from his place as a Christian. I should warn people, there is a brief depiction of the so-called piss Christ here, so you just know that's coming.
Or a subject that interests you?
Well, I was born and raised a Catholic, and I've been a Christian all my life. And I never realized how in tune I was with Christianity until I began to do my early work, and then I saw a lot of references to the Catholic Church, to Jesus. And I realized that it was something I was drawn to, even, almost beyond my power to control it.
So it was almost subconscious. Now, religion has been at the centre of a lot of controversy surrounding your pieces. Your reputation precedes you a little here in France. In 2011, a row erupted in Avignon in the south of France over a piece of art called Piss Christ, which purports to be a photograph of a crucifix in your own urine. There were demonstrations against the photo, and it was even vandalised. How did you feel about these attacks on your work?
Well, these attacks are usually generated by people who have their own agenda, even, particularly when they're conservative or right-wing extremists. In that case, I think it was the Bishop of Avignon who incited the rabble. And it's always someone who has an agenda other than mine. Mine is as an artist and as a Christian.
Well, you were defended.
Oh,
indeed.
yeah, I think...
he like didn't explain it at all.
No, he didn't. He just keeps falling back on the, oh no, don't worry, I'm a Christian. And I'm
an
using
artist.
it pretty transparently as a veneer for, don't impose your vision. You should respect my vision. But I'm not going to tell you what my vision is. I'm just going to show this image of Christ in a jar of urine. And if you have a problem with it, you must be a right-wing extremist. It's, I think, a pretty ludicrous way, honestly, of dealing with criticism. I mean, if I said something that was really shocking and controversial, and then people got upset, and I just said, oh, why would you be upset about that? You're just imposing your radical right-wing or radical left-wing vision on what I had to say. Well, it's like, no. Statements need to be interpreted, and artistic statements need to be interpreted. And if you're making a statement that everyone's interpreting in the same way, and that's not the way you intend, you can't just like shrug it off haughtily and say, well, I'm the artist. Any more than a speaker who says something that sounds really shocking and controversial can't just shrug off the fact that everybody's misunderstanding them. Like, maybe you're saying something in the wrong way. And if you knew or should have known, people would interpret it this way. You do have an obligation to clarify. In the case of something like putting a crucifix in a thing of urine, this looks objectively blasphemous, regardless of whatever intentions might be in your heart of hearts. When you're desecrating a sacred image, that is what blasphemy is. Like, in the same way that if you used a bunch of like blasphemous language, you wouldn't be able to say, well, I meant it ironically. I meant it, satirically. I meant it as an homage to God. And so again, I think this is a paper thin kind of excuse, but the kind of thing that we see of, if you compare what he just said there to the way people are defending Jolly's kind of work in the opening ceremony, it strikes me as a lot of the same sort of weak explanation of like, well, maybe this is an homage and not a mockery. And that's always a legitimate thing to be asking. But there does come a time where you just say, this thing is gross and shouldn't happen.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can bring it kind of full circle as we wrap up. And I'll just ask you, like, how do you think Christians should have responded to this whole situation? Should they have tried to do what they've done and point out, despite what they've claimed, that it was intentionally, if anything, it was imitating the Last Supper painting by Da Vinci? And so, yeah, but how should Christians have responded to this?
I think I would avoid two responses and I'd go for a third. So I would avoid the response of just knee-jerk outrage. I think people who spend a lot of time online are used to just being constantly provoked and outraged on purpose because it's really good for the algorithm. Anger is stickier than joy. You're more likely to remember a slight than you are to remember a compliment. This is an unfortunate feature of our neurology, but it's something that social media companies are really good at tapping into. They want you to be constantly outraged because you'll stick around more. You'll say provocative things. People will then respond. And you'll have a cycle of outrage. If you say good job to something, that doesn't lead to a cycle of people being like, yeah, you're right, that was a good job. And then, yeah, you're right, it was a good job. Like, that doesn't happen. But if you say you're an idiot, then you're going to get the no, you're an idiot, and then the whole series. So it leads to a whole series of replies and rebuttals. Like, you don't have response videos when somebody's doing a good job. And
well, it's like these days it's almost like a race to who can say the dumbest thing, the most uninformed thing first.
Right.
And whoever wins that race gets all the views.
And this is it, because it can't just be you're making a good point. Because if you're making a point that everybody kind of knows and everybody agrees with, they'll be like, yeah, that's right. And that ends the engagement. So I would just say, as a general rule, when you're watching anything in the news, be looking for something that is both anger-inducing and just ambiguous enough that there can be two sides to the issue. And when you have that, you have the kind of stuff that's going to go viral, and you don't have to let it. Like, you don't have to make the world more full of outrageous viral material. You don't have to contribute to the virus. You can resist that and say, I'm not going to engage in this one. And so,
well, I mean, you
in
can.
that situation. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, you can also just put a little bit of effort into researching the situation itself, right, and spend at least, if you want to comment on something, spend at least a couple hours looking into it and really like trying to find the areas where, okay, actually, you know, there's some missing information here that we kind of need before we make a big claim about what's actually going on. This is one of the reasons why I haven't actually even commented on the whole Imam Khalif situation. I think that's the way you pronounce their name. So I haven't even, I'm kind of working on a response to that right now, but there's some information that is sort of missing right now from the whole conversation. But it hasn't stopped people from wanting to immediately comment on it. And like you said, like the one idiot says something, then the next idiot says something and says, no, you're an idiot. I mean,
that's a great example.
Like everybody is using, insufficient information. But everyone nevertheless feels like they have to voice their opinion about it.
Yeah, I think we saw that with this, where it was like, well, this is obviously the Last Supper, and this was obviously an outrage. And then it was like, oh, this is obviously not the Last Supper. And it's like, both of you stop and just take a breath and do like a little more research before you just announce very assertively. Because both sides, I think, were wrong. And I think likewise in the Imam Khalif situation, that first it was, oh, this is definitely like a man who is presenting as transgender as a woman. And then it's like, no, this is actually biologically a woman who's always lived as a woman. And now, I mean, the latest thing I've heard is this is biologically a man who's phenotypically female. So it's someone with an XY chromosome, but appears female. This is a very rare condition. So I don't know. I mean, maybe tomorrow we're going to find out some totally different situation, but it was like the very assertive outrage and the very assertive kind of smug counter outrage of like, how dare you think the thing you saw was real? Those two sets of voices, and you get that on almost every issue. There's a knee-jerk response, and then there's a smug sort of response to the knee-jerk response, and they're both almost always unhelpful, and they're both almost always like unedifying.
So how should Christians be? Were you about to mention something else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, how should we be? Colossians 3. St. Paul tells us to put away what's earthly inside of us: immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness. But then he also says, now put all of them away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and foul talk from your mouth. So we need to begin by not responding with like gross immorality, but also not responding with anger, wrath, and malice. Instead, he talks about how we need to put on compassion, kindness, lowliness, meekness, and patience. And so if our response is habitually characterized by patient response, you may patiently have to rebuke somebody sometimes, but it shouldn't just be because you're coming off totally hot-headed. It should be because like, oh no, objectively this is wrong and you shouldn't have done this. You can respond in a Christian way to outrages. You can be righteously angry, but so often I think we're just failing to put away our own anger, wrath, and malice, and leaning into those when we should be overcoming them for maybe a more nuanced and charitable sort of response.
Let's take a super chat that was sent in a little bit earlier from Christian Left 7. Chaps, I'm sorry, while we shouldn't respond like other faiths or how Andrew Tate would have us respond, but we should speak out with love, Matthew 10:33. And I'll pull up that verse really quickly for those of you that don't know it off the top of your head. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. See,
I don't think that means you have to be knee-jerk outraged. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the response is, if you respond to the situation in the opening Olympics by denying Christ, you've definitely chosen the wrong option. But I don't think any of the options on the table were that.
Yeah. Yeah, just because, even if you chose to be silent about it, that doesn't mean that you're denying Christ.
Right. You can acknowledge Christ without feeling the need to acknowledge everything in the news cycle. Yeah. In fact, the news cycle often draws you away from Christ.
Mm-hmm. So now, okay, last one. Last question for you, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
So you mentioned like when it has to do with blaspheming God as opposed to blaspheming your if someone mocks you, the way that you should respond should probably be closer to the way that Jesus responded when he was mocked. But if someone is mocking God or the Holy Spirit, then there are other examples from Jesus like overturning the temple and stuff. So what would you suggest? Like if you're convinced that someone is openly mocking God in this way or mocking the God of Christianity, how should we go and commit violence against? How should we respond?
I think that it's much better. So a lot depends on the particulars of the situation. I mean, if one thing has been a consistent theme, I think it's that Christianity's never had a one-size-fits-all response to this. And it's often been in the sense of rebuke. It's been saying, don't do this. And if it's a fellow Christian, there may be a question of church discipline, people even being excommunicated at the most extreme. So you don't have people like Serrano using his kind of Christian credentials to cover for his blasphemy. If he's excommunicated, he doesn't get to do that in the same way. But if it's somebody who's not Christian, then it may be a question of speaking out against it. If you're, a YouTuber, say, you might do a response video. If you know them personally, you may address it with them personally, or you may address it publicly. And whatever the case, whatever that looks like, the one thing you should certainly be doing is taking the situation before God so you can properly discern it, and making some kind of act of reparation, like praying to glorify the name of God in response to some attempt to demean and degrade the name of God.
Joe, I appreciate you coming on. I feel kind of bad because I was hoping that we could have had a better conversation, only in the sense of like if I wasn't feeling the way that I'm feeling, I feel like we could have had some more interesting interactions.
If this conversation was bad, I take full responsibility. We'll let people decide in the comments. Just say never have Joe back. If this is a bad conversation, I think I can safely say this because the people have made it to the end. Okay. Just jump in the comments. Right. I didn't think you were. I don't think people would even know you had a migraine if you didn't announce it. So.
Okay. Yeah. Anyways, no, Joe, it's been great to have you back on, and I didn't know this about you, but you actually have a background in lawyering, right?
Yeah, I used to be a lawyer. Yep.
You used to be a lawyer. So why did you go from, a job that probably has financial stability to, well, I can't really say that because you work for Catholic Answers and they're a pretty stable organization.
They are, but I didn't immediately. So I went from working for Catholic Answers to being a seminarian to working for a small kind of apologetics organization to now working for Catholic Answers. So there was a long period where I was like, I think I'm just never going to make any money. And I was like, all right, that's fine. I'll just have all this student loan debt and I'll eventually die. So, but it was really this sense that even when I was an attorney, I, in my free time, was blogging about theology and apologetics. And it was so clearly
that's exactly what I was doing.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I was doing. Well, I mean, obviously not as a lawyer, but I was definitely
as a photographer, right? Yeah,
dude, I was like constantly thinking about this. How it actually began is I got this job. Initially, I started out as a photo editor, and while I was photo editing, like I would pull up a batch of photos to edit, and then I would put on a debate like between William Lane Craig and someone else. And
some poor
people thought I was. People got so upset because they thought I wasn't working, and I was like, I'm just listening to this while I'm working, and it like caused some issues. But yeah, I'm in the same boat. Like I was just constantly thinking about anytime. Like I would get in the car because I had a really long commute, and so I would get in the car and I would just listen to podcasts and listen to anything related to apologetics for hours and hours and hours.
What is it? Jeremiah, right? Says, "You duped me, Lord, and I allowed myself to be duped." It's like this sense of you want to close your mouth and not talk about it, but you cannot help talking about the things of God. Yeah, it's Jeremiah 20. And so that kind of thing, it was like, I certainly felt that. I actually started a blog because I was being so obnoxious with my friends who were not Catholic, being like, do you know about this thing? Like, have you read John 6 about the Eucharist? And the people were just like, calm down. Like, we're all in law school at the time. We've got huge workloads. Nobody's wanting to get into, well, I actually had one good Dutch Calvinist friend who would love getting into these lengthy, like multi-hour long theological conversations. But like my secular friends were just like, what are you talking about? You crazy person. And so having it as like an outlet to talk about this with people who also have that bug was the beginning of this whole way of life and career for me, which is beautiful.
I mentioned the whole lawyering thing because I feel like I connect with you. I definitely don't have like a background in lawyering at all, but I feel like that's a very positive attribute to have when it comes to apologetics. I mean, it is like apologia. It comes from like giving a defense in a lawyer case or in a court case. And so I feel like we have some sort of, I feel like we jive on some deep level.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm happy to jive with you. Yeah, I think we're often on the same wavelength on things. I appreciate the takes you offer on things too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's schedule some more stuff. And guys, you guys have, if you're still watching up until this point, let me know if you'd like me to invite Joe back on to talk about something else. If you have a specific topic in mind that you'd like us to discuss, also feel free to mention that. And then let me know what you think. I mean, we covered a super chat from someone earlier about sort of a new direction for the channel, but let me know what your thoughts are and ways that we can improve that without sort of abandoning what we started out to do. If you have ideas on how to marry the new sort of broadening of our topics with the deeper philosophical analysis that we've done so much in the past, if you've got ideas, I'm definitely open to them. Right now, as I say, I'm in this very much an exploratory mode, and it's actually been helping a lot with my mental health issues that I've got. I deal with both anxiety and depression, and so being able to expand and talk about other topics has been great for me just personally. So it's been awesome. But
that's also good.
Yeah, let me know.
People in the comments, don't be a jerk to Christian or Cameron. Capturing Christianity is not part of your name. So, be kind to Cameron. Respect him even when you're disagreeing. Don't be a jerk to people who suffer with anxiety and depression. That's rude.
Yeah, that'd be nice. That would be nice. Anyways, all right, Joe. We'll talk to you later. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on. Peace.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next one. See you guys. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?